Hello, everybody, and welcome into Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodities sector. My name is Jesse Day, and on today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Doomberg to the program. The author of the Doomberg Substack, the #1 paid finance newsletter on that platform, where he writes about energy analysis with a refreshingly honest twist. We are going to dig deep into the potential energy crisis that could emerge as Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz amidst the rapidly escalating conflict with Israel, and the United States hints that they may enter the fray. Could this war pose a threat to oil supply worldwide, and what would that do to the price of WTI crude? We're going to discuss the gold market and the implications of out-of-control debt, geopolitical uncertainty, and wars ramping up on the price of gold. Will safe haven demand be the next major catalyst? We're also going to talk about Germany potentially reversing course on its ban on nuclear energy. Are rational policymakers finally prevailing, or is that nation doomed to have their feet held to the fire by the continued incompetence and radical ideology of the environmental left? Before we dive in today, Commodity Culture now has merch. Get your hat, hoodie, t-shirt, or mug, all backed by a 100% quality guarantee using the link in the description below. And now, my friends, strap yourselves in for my conversation with Doomberg. Doomberg, great to have you back on Commodity Culture. I want to kick things off today with discussing the Israel-Iran conflict, one that looks increasingly like the U.S. might potentially get involved. You wrote this in your recent piece on Substack titled Fog Lights. Few events blur the line between analysis and advocacy as thoroughly as war, especially for those with strong personal or ideological ties to the combatants. The challenge is compounded by the relentless flood of propaganda from both sides, making it difficult to distinguish signal from noise. We live in an interesting world. I think things are becoming particularly more polarized due to social media. And, when we're looking at Israel, Hamas, for example, Israel, Palestine, it's always been, do you stand with Israel? Do you stand with Palestine? You have to pick a side. And now that same attitude looks like it's emerging right now when it comes to Israel and Iran and America. How are you viewing this situation, and what do you think the consequences could be?
Jesse, first, it's great to be back with you. Always enjoy our conversations. First thing I would say is, even though we wrote that in our piece, very few people read it or let it sink in, because our comments for that piece were just filled with a lot of hate from both sides. By the way, we have no close ties to this conflict. And our job as analysts is to try to understand what's going on, especially as it pertains to the energy markets. And so we had written a piece last October called October Surprise, where we incorrectly predicted that Israel would not attack Iran, predominantly because of the efficacy of Iran's counter-missile strike on October 1st, 2024, which, to our eyes, and social media videos confirm, the once vaunted Israeli air defense systems seem to be not quite up to the task of defending against the barrage of missiles, at least not all of them, the barrage of missiles that Iran had sent over. And in that piece, we described how most of Israel's electricity comes from just 5 power plants, and more than half of its drinking water comes from 5 desalination plants, and all of its natural gas comes from just 2 installations. And that's like a dozen targets that are stationary, that everybody knows where they are. And we listed the axioms of our analysis, and one of them was completely wrong. We're not quite sure which one was, but so when the attacks happened a week ago now, we knew that we were wrong, and we would have to write a follow-up piece, because as an analyst and not an advocate, your job is to figure out what's going on to the best of your ability with the limited information that you have. And as we said in that quote that you started this podcast with, separating signal from noise is especially hard, and it's impossible if you're emotionally attached to it. Like, people who are swimming in propaganda are the last ones to want to admit it. By the way, we're all swimming in propaganda, and we think about that all the time. So whenever we see information, is this AI? Is this real? Is the source credible? Is the source biased? Okay, even if they're biased, they're telling you information. So this is why we read propaganda from all the sides, because it gives you a better chance of understanding what's going on. But, it's, we were talking before you hit record. It's just amazing that we're here, sad. Most of the victims aren't combatants. It's been the case since October 7th, which I think is the catalyst for the events that we've seen over the past week. War is terrible. War is regrettable. War should be avoided at all costs, and it's sad that war has broken out here.
And now a quick break to hear from our sponsor, ARC Silver Gold. Osmium owner Ian Everard is considered one of the most honest and level-headed gold and silver dealers in the United States, praised even by his competitors. So give him a call today to take advantage of the specials right now. Silver Kangaroos 2023 1-ounce coins, mint fresh, only $2.47 over spot. Mint fresh silver maple leafs 2025 coins, 1 ounce, $2.87 over spot. While supplies last. Reach out today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. And now, back to the interview. One thing I want to note is how all of the politicians in the U.S. seem to be stepping in line when it comes to support for Israel. And, you know, someone in the comments is going to call me an anti-Semite for even bringing this up. But we had Ted Cruz recently sitting down with Tucker Carlson. Now, I'm no fan of Tucker Carlson, but Ted Cruz was proclaiming that he read in the Bible that everybody must support Israel. And so there's no need for a debate on the matter. We've, of course, all heard about AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and how much sway they have over U.S. Congress. Do you see this as a major issue, and how could it be resolved?
So, I again, as an analyst, we don't get emotionally attached to such positions. We do observe quite clearly, for example, that Israel is going to get much more direct and long-lasting support from the United States than Ukraine is, which is an input into our analysis. So, okay, one of the big losers from what happened last week is that Ukraine is going to get the short end of the military stick. And already we see Zelensky quite appropriately panicking a little bit on social media and calling this out and concern. And we see an uptick in Russia's activity in what they would call the special military operation, what the rest of us normal people would call a war. And so, you know, whether or not you think certain organizations control members of Congress and so on isn't really all that relevant. What you need to understand is, what is the U.S. going to do? And by the way, like, it should be said, I mean, Senator Cruz beclowned himself in that interview. It was a disaster for him. Again, I Tucker Carlson is interesting in the sense that at least he's trying to do long-form interviews, sort of like a political version of Joe Rogan. And sometimes we learn interesting things when we watch them. I couldn't watch that interview. It was too cringy after a while, even the clips on social media. And so the thing we took away from that interview is just how ignorant Senator Cruz is on the matter, and how flippantly many of the leaders in Washington just decide to go to war. And look, we got a lot of hate because we're unabashedly anti-war. War is always a racket. And we've been going to war in the Middle East over weapons of mass destruction for as long as I've been an adult. And it's amazing to me that here we are again. Look, for Israel, it's existential. They, whether or not you agree with Netanyahu's approach, you could debate that. But they're surrounded by people who don't like them. And Iran, has been chanting death to Israel, death to the U.S. for decades. I think that's undeniable. But at the same time, it's not like the U.S. has the cleanest history in Iran either. Go back to the Shah and that era. And so when you're attached to it, you only hear one side of things. And anybody who even brings up a question like you just did is going to get, raked over the coals by those who are advocates, not necessarily trying to do analysis.
And the whole impetus for this, the story we're being told in the media by both the U.S. and Israel, is that Iran is just about to complete a nuclear weapons program, and they can't allow that to happen. Now, Netanyahu, there's video compilations of him saying this exact thing since the 1990s. So pretty interesting that they're now bringing it up again. Like, okay, guys, no, this time is for real. Iran is about to unleash nuclear weapons on everybody. So we have to strike them in self-defense. That's basically been this bizarre argument, the way it's worked out so far. However, why is Iran not allowed to have nuclear weapons? Why is Israel and America allowed to have nuclear weapons, but Iran, God forbid, we have to stop them at all costs? What's the logic there?
So it's a complex question. First of all, there is actually international law which dictates what countries are allowed and not allowed to do, although we would say, again, another analysis based on observation is international law is irrelevant now. The United Nations Security Council is an irrelevant, flaccid talking body. Nothing the United Nations Security Council does means anything. And look, I mean, Israel preemptively struck Iran. And by the way, even Trump, like, I will decide in the next 2 weeks if the U.S. goes to war. I thought Congress declared war. And this is a pretty major war we're talking about. So the old rules, especially as it pertains to proliferation, are out the window. And in fact, back and forth with some of the people who were annoyed by our piece, Foglights, who's to say that preemptively striking Iran's nuclear facilities, A, can even theoretically be effective, B, won't convince them they need to accelerate their nuclear ambitions, and C, convince every other dictatorship that might be in the Western crosshairs that they better start developing their own weapons post-haste. They're one of the things that frustrates us, but again, you have to sort of just observe it for what it is the Lindsey Grahams of the world just assume nobody ever punches back. Like we've been saying on podcasts, and we said in the piece, well, wars are a lot easier to start than they are to end. And the barrier to going to war should be very, very, very high. Now, of course, the supporters of Israel will say, hey, they were weeks away from a nuclear bomb, which, as you correctly said, Netanyahu's been saying forever, and color us a little skeptical, especially post-Iraq, and Colin Powell at the United Nations, holding up a vial full of powder. We've heard this before. Now, okay, maybe this time is real. Well, then if you hadn't lied about it the first time, then maybe the warnings this time would be, more broadly accepted. And then the last thing I would say is Trump is running a serious risk of fracturing his base here. You can see on Twitter the same thing that we see. Many of the most influential pro-Trump MAGA types are having serious misgivings about this adventure. Bannon, Tucker, Jack, Tim Pool, you name it, and they're being pretty loud about it. Others are defending Trump. Others are saying, let's wait and see. Maybe this is a negotiation tactic. But Trump, this is a monumental decision for Trump. And if Seymour Hersh's reporting from yesterday is correct, we're recording this on Friday. Looks like Trump might go this weekend, despite saying he's going to take 2 weeks to make the decision. I don't know. It's just amazing that we're here again. Weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, wasn't Trump supposed to be a peacetime president who was going to put a quick end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and keep the U.S. out of further war? It seems abundantly clear that, the U.S. was involved in Israel's attacks on Iran, at least in terms of supplying the weapons and having knowledge, despite their own denial. Yeah, and his policy towards the war in Ukraine has been completely confusing and at times seemingly counterproductive. At one point, he'll threaten sanctions on Russia and, Putin's not playing ball. And then the next, he'll say he's going to sanction Ukraine or call Zelensky, not stepping up to the plate. I mean, it's been back and forth. Am I missing something here? Is the president playing 4D chess, or is it as bad as it looks?
I mean, I hope he's playing 4D chess, but it's starting the probabilities of that are starting to dwindle. Look, we live in flyover country. I know many people who voted for Trump. I've been canvassing them over the week informally, and I would say 90-10 are opposed to this. Of the people that voted for Trump that we have spoken to, the vast majority think that this is a betrayal of one of the main reasons that they voted for him, which is they're sick of forever wars. And getting entangled again in yet another war was not on the priority list. I mean, he was elected to handle immigration, to cut government spending. He's working hard on the immigration front, but the spending stuff, we'll see. Doge was a failure. I think it's pretty safe to say. Disappointing to us, by the way. We had much higher hopes for Doge than what ultimately came true. But if he gets entangled in this war, which it's got to be 95-5 that the U.S. will. I mean, I can't imagine a path out. Who knows? But, when you decapitate the lead negotiators of the other side, it makes them less likely to want to negotiate. Then, last point I'd say is the decapitation strikes like almost always backfire, right? They drive unity in the country. And so to your question, about Ukraine and Trump's policies there, not only are wars harder to win than to start, they're much harder to lose. And the slow loss of the war in Ukraine is why Trump couldn't get a deal done with Putin, because why would the Russians agree to a ceasefire when they're clearly, the momentum is on their side? And absent broad U.S. help, it's hard to see how Ukraine holds out for another year. And then finally, to your point again about the chaos of it all, the West is short of anti-missile arms. The strikes in Ukraine, Zelensky's claims of shooting down 99% of everything in the sky notwithstanding, just looking at the video, you can see that there's very little in the way of air defense in Ukraine today. And, one of the things we warned about is Iran has a lot of missiles and can be resupplied by China. And so, Israel's a very small place. And if the broader West is short of anti-missile technology, the war in Israel is going to exacerbate that. And it looks like, here we are a week later, video emerging despite massive censorship, a video emerging this morning of a significant number of missiles landing in Israel, cutting through the air defense systems. And we are a week into it when the war was supposed to be, I think, won by now. And so if this goes on for another month, what does that mean? And so the U.S. probably has to get involved. But then just because the U.S. gets involved doesn't mean that the war is going to be won. The U.S. has been involved in Ukraine from day one. Just last point, taking out their enrichment site does not end the war. It's not the end of a short war. It's the beginning of a long one. There's no exit plan here, which is why you're seeing this backlash amongst Trump supporters.
Yeah, it all seems like madness. I want to talk about how this conflict could affect the energy markets, because we've already seen quite a spike in WTI crude since Israel's first attack. There is concern out there about Israel and potentially the U.S. causing major damage to Iranian oil production capacity, and of course the possibility of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, both factors that will be negative for global oil supplies. How do you assess the risk here? Is this more noise than signal, or is there real cause for concern?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And this is obviously what we spent most of our time thinking about since the war has broken out. And there's a lot of pretty scary scenarios. So just to calibrate people, the Middle East as a whole produces 30% of the world's oil. And 2/3 of that goes through Hormuz. Okay, so 20 million barrels a day goes through that strait. There is no contingency planning for losing that much volume from the global markets. Now, taking out Iranian production facilities is not nearly as bad as closing the straits. Whether Iran could close the strait or not remains to be seen. But if it does, there are ways, by the way, it probably can be done. For example, insurance companies won't want to be insuring tankers full of flammable liquids and LNG carriers, which are floating bombs. So just the mere threat of it, or a few missiles launched in that area, might cause a de facto closing of it, even if it's not militarily fully closed. So one of the things that we think would happen in that scenario, obviously, is we would quickly find out that there isn't one price of oil. WTI is basically North American oil, and Brent is international oil, and there's other grades as well. We would begin to see significant price divergences, because I don't believe that President Trump would allow exports before taking care of the domestic consumer and military needs. And so we could see strict controls, a fracturing of the market. Like right now, the various grades of crude roughly trade highly correlated. Once we start to see that split, could be a challenge. Another big deal is 20% of the world's LNG comes from Qatar, and it's on the wrong side of that strait. And so they share the North Slope gas field with Iran, and Israel's already targeted some of the Iranian infrastructure related to natural gas production from that field. So you have the region that would suffer the most is Europe, by far. Because it doesn't produce any of its own hydrocarbons. So you would very quickly find out just how important producing your own hydrocarbons is. And the two countries that produce, the two military powers that produce vastly more oil and gas than they need are the United States and Russia. And so what we could see, if Iranian supply is knocked off, but the strait isn't closed, that Russia would fill the void for China. Last point I would make is China has very cleverly insulated itself in a way, or at least spread the risk of being short crude, because it is one of the largest, it is the largest refiner in the world from a capacity perspective. And its neighbors would rely on China being able to refine that crude as much as China needs the crude. And so there's all kinds of second and third order chaotic effects of this war that would very quickly make the normal functioning of markets quite chaotic.
Do you think if we do see the US enter the war, that Russia and China would respond in some way or another? Obviously, they are allies of Iran. Russia having signed a defense agreement. Now, I think it's important to note that from what I understand, the defense agreement that Russia has signed with Iran does not mean they rush in and start counterattacking if Iran is attacked. It's a different type of agreement. Perhaps you know more details on that than I do. But how do you see Russia and China potentially reacting if this war continues to escalate?
So this is why it's important to read everybody's propaganda, because really since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, inside of Russia and China, the last 3+ years have been framed as World War III. And this is just the next phase of World War III. And of course, Russia and China are going to help Iran. China would love nothing more than for the US to punch itself out in the Middle East, setting back its ambitions to take on China by 5 to 10 years. Russia would love nothing more than for US military support to be diverted from Ukraine, which is in their primary interest. And so, perversely, China and Russia have sort of a military benefit from an extended war of attrition in the Middle East. And so that needs to be factored into people's considerations. Like, Israel's a very tiny place, you know, they have a small population. Iran's a big country. It's shocking that Ted Cruz doesn't know the population of Iran. But 92 million is 92 million, a mountainous country, very hard to defeat. And so I think you're going to see, much like in the way China has been supplying weaponry and assistance to Russia in exchange for energy, they'll both do the same for Iran, and then keep an eye on North Korea. Again, this is World War III. The Western sort of Atlanticist coalition against the emerging BRICS nations, and you could even view it as a war over the dollar. And so, Iran is just the next front in that war.
Well, let's talk about the gold market here for a moment. Do you anticipate perhaps more safe haven demand being driven into the gold market by all these events we've been discussing? Normally, when it comes to the gold price rising in response to headline news items and these sorts of conflicts, it tends to come back down. It generally doesn't tend to be a sustained rise in the price. Could this time be different? And what's your overall assessment of the gold market right now?
Yeah, the gold market and the stock market are not signaling war. Right? They're not signaling significant escalation. And frankly, the oil market is a slightly different question. We estimate that there's about a $20 geopolitical risk premium in WTI right now, because our equilibrium price of oil is 55 and it's trading at 75. So, $20 of risk premium is substantial, and it's probably adjusted correctly. But to have that level of risk premium in the oil market and have the gold and stock markets be so subdued is a bit of a mystery to us. We shall see. But as it pertains to gold, if our framing or the popular framing of this as being World War III and a war over the dollar and war over BRICS, gold is going to play a central role in whatever economic environment that persists in the aftermath of World War III, assuming we're not all dead from nuclear fallout. And so, as a neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade, gold is becoming ever more present in the share of reserves around the world. I noted with interest that gold is now in the second spot behind treasuries, ahead of European debt in the global reserve leaderboard, and climbing. As the West continues to sanction and to seize Russia's reserves and to sanction Iran and to sanction everybody in China, the utility of the dollar as a weapon gets limper and limper. And so I do think that the real issue for gold is not panic buying into the face of a war or selling because peace breaks out, however unlikely that might seem today. It's the long-term function of gold in international trade and the restoration of gold as a store of value and a neutral reserve asset. And I think in order for gold to play that role, the price of it as measured in US dollars needs to be much higher.
Do you think we will see gold used more in international trade? Obviously, we're not hearing that much anymore about the BRICS gold backed currency. This was a big rumor swirling about for quite some time that it was going to be announced, and obviously, nothing has come forth. Now, it's obviously much more complex to set up such a payment system between different member nations with different goals and different ideologies, as a lot of people have pointed out. Is that whole idea dead in the water, or do you think we could see gold used more frequently in some form or another when it comes to international trade?
I think it is already, and you don't need a currency to do that. You just need an agreement to settle imbalances and a mechanism to, convert claims into physical. Um, and so I think we're seeing that today. A lot of trade is being netted out in gold, and you don't need all the trade. You just need the imbalances to be netted out. And I think that explains the substantial rise in the US dollar price of gold in the past 2 years. And so that trend will only accelerate in our view. And that's one of the casualties of this war is the old financial system is starting to come to an end. And the friction of the upcoming transition is going to be very, very high.
Let's shift to nuclear energy and uranium because it looks like Germany could be reversing course on its nuclear ban. You wrote this in a piece titled Chain Reaction on Substack. The German move is but one in a dizzying array of positive nuclear energy developments emerging across Europe. In the past several months, country after country has reconsidered its attitude toward the technology, perhaps setting the stage for the beleaguered continent to mark a bottom in sanity and pivot back towards physics. Obviously, we're seeing the bullish news for nuclear keeping piling up. And now, after a long lull, the uranium equities are finally responding in a pretty big way. Your thoughts on both the new nuclear renaissance as it's developing and the potential investment opportunity presented by uranium right now?
Yeah, so it's all put at risk right now if we start, wantonly attacking nuclear structures. And the precedents that might be set in this current conflict might lead certain bad actors to take revenge. The U.S. has 93 reactors, for example. A lot of people across the border don't know who they are. They have of military age. And so, the wanton destruction of energy facilities, in our view, beginning with the Nord Stream pipeline, which is undoubtedly a war crime, and then Putin's attacks on the Ukrainian electricity grid, which is, again, a series of war crimes. Not that anybody cares anymore, but that is the one risk to the thesis. A major attack on a nuclear facility could put the pause on things, much in the way that Fukushima did, after the tsunami. That to one side, we would be bullish companies that could benefit from the construction and operation of nuclear power plants. But as a general rule, we find it difficult to get excited about being long the commodity directly, because in the long run, the real price of all commodities is lower. Oil, natural gas, uranium. Now, uranium is a bit different because you have an active financial instrument that is attempting to corner the market. But broadly, the world is awash in uranium and there's plenty of supply. And so we would look for companies that enable as opposed to the commodity itself. Now, the commodity itself could go up, it could go down, but in the long run, if the only commodity worth buying is gold, because it's the only thing that keeps its value. If you plot all of these commodities in ounces of gold, they just get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's because the companies that mine them or produce them are deflationary powerhouses. And so, and they're price takers. And so uranium's uranium, right? And so if oil gets cheaper, it gets cheaper to mine uranium. People's break-even prices are lower. So, much better to fade super spikes in commodities than it is to try to time them. And so if we see a super spike in oil that brings it up to 130 or 140, much safer bet to say that oil is going to be $40 or we're all going to be dead within a year and trade that as opposed to trying to, let your call premiums decay out while you're waiting to catch the upside on a spike. Now, if you do catch an upside on a spike, you can make a lot of money, and that is what lures people into the whole thesis. But in our view, any company that profits from volume of nuclear reactors is much more interesting than the commodity itself.
And when looking at the global energy mix right now, how do you see an energy source like coal playing a role. Are you still seeing coal use climbing? Do you think there's an opportunity there in what is traditionally such a hated sector that most people are leaving behind for dead? Obviously, we saw a massive run in a lot of the coal stocks that's since reversed. What are your overall thoughts on the coal sector?
I mean, there's a huge amount of coal in the world right now. China is mining way more than it needs and still importing because it's stockpiling. And this is a direct consequence of the energy crisis that unfolded in Europe, 21 and 22, that caught China off guard and caused the price of coal to spike and the markets to get a little wacky. And so I'm very curious. Next week, the 2025 edition of the Statistical Review of World Energy is published, and I'm curious to see what the latest numbers for coal production and demand were last year. I think it would be a very telling deck, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But coal is, trading at $107. Newcastle coal, $107 a ton right now. Fairly balanced, roughly on par with U.S. natural gas on an energy content basis. There's plenty of it, and so I wouldn't get too excited about coal.
I know the Doomberg team has their finger on the pulse of a lot happening when it comes to geopolitics, the global economy, energy. What are you watching right now that you think more people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so we are watching. So energy markets are correlated during normal times. So in well-supplied markets, landed LNG should sell for roughly the same price as Brent crude on an energy content basis. So you just take the LNG price at Dutch TTF contract and multiply by 5.6, and you get the oil equivalent price of liquefied natural gas. They're trading in lockstep still. And Brent and WTI are trading in lockstep still. If we start to see significant divergences, especially between Brent and WTI, or between LNG and Brent, then we know that something is about to pop off. Or at least we know that the market thinks it is. The market could be wrong, of course. And so right now, across the board, we see commodities behaving as though everything is normal. So if we had the chart of oil, LNG, coal, you would say, maybe there's an accident somewhere. Oil is up a little bit, but LNG is trading in lockstep. So the markets are pretty well supplied and pretty normal. You wouldn't know. There's a kinetic war between Iran and Israel going on just by looking at the charts. And so if something happens over the weekend, we'll see how the markets open Sunday night. But until we start to see significant divergences between various grades of oil and between oil and LNG, the markets are signaling that there's risk premium there. There's a possibility, but they're not really betting on it.
Great analysis, as always. Tell us about the Doomberg Substack and what it is you do there.
Yeah, Doomberg.com. We write 7 to 9 articles a month. We also have a pro tier where we do a monthly webinar. This month's webinar for June is called Goldileo, the yellow stone at the center of the financial universe. We're going to do a deep dive on everybody's favorite pet rock. And all of our podcasts are listed there. We just added some high quality products to our merch store, doomberg.myshopify.com or myshopify.doomberg.com. Want to string them together and you'll get it. But mostly we write blogs, and we have a great time doing it. And always a pleasure to talk to you, Jesse. Thanks for having us back on.
Great. I'll put a link in the description below to Doomberg.com for people who want to check it out. Always a blast, Doomberg. Thank you for coming on.
You bet.
And thank you for joining us today. Take advantage of ARC Silver Gold Osmium Specials. Silver Kangaroos 2023 1-ounce coins, $2.47 over spot. Silver Maple Leafs 2025 1-ounce coins, $2.87 over spot. Well supplies last. Reach out to owner Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. Also, make sure to grab your Commodity Culture merch, hat, hoodie, t-shirt, mug, all backed by a 100% quality guarantee. Find it using the link in the description below. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.